What happens when a simple question from a young boy sparks a chain of events that makes even the most powerful pause and reflect? Discover how one child's search for answers brings the world together in a way no one expected. The gymnasium buzzed with energy. Folding chairs lined the floor, filled with people from all walks of life. Some were here to cheer, some to challenge, but all were curious. At the center of it all was Donald Trump, seated behind a polished wooden table, his sharp blue suit contrasting against the plain backdrop of the town hall stage. 8-year-old Jacob fidgeted in his seat near the back of the room. His grandmother, a devout woman with a well-worn Bible tucked under her arm, had insisted they attend. Jacob didn't quite understand politics, but he knew enough to sense the weight of the moment. His grandmother whispered prayers under her breath, her wrinkled hands folded tightly. "Do you think he'll answer my question, Grandma?" Jacob asked, his voice barely audible over the din. She smiled gently. "If it's meant to be, Jacob, God will make sure he hears you." Jacob clutched the paper in his hand, a simple note he'd scribbled the night before. It wasn't a political question, but one that had burned in his mind since his father's funeral 6 months ago. Why does God let bad things happen? As the event began, Trump fielded questions about jobs, healthcare, and foreign policy. The crowd cheered and clapped, but Jacob barely listened. His heart thumped as he waited for his turn. Finally, the moderator scanned the room for the next question. Jacob raised his hand tentatively, unsure if he'd be noticed among the sea of adults. To his surprise, the moderator pointed at him. "You there, young man?" she said, her tone softening. "What's your question?" The microphone was passed to Jacob, and all eyes turned to the little boy standing in his oversized sweater. His voice trembled as he spoke. "Mr. Trump, do you believe in God? And why does he let bad things happen to good people?" The room fell silent. Trump's confident demeanor shifted as the weight of the question sank in. He leaned forward, his expression uncharacteristically soft. "That's a big question, young man," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "And one I don't take lightly." Jacob's wide eyes held Trump's gaze, and for a moment the crowd disappeared. It was just a little boy seeking answers and a man grappling with how to give them. Trump leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. The question had caught him off guard, not because he didn't have an answer, but because of the boy's sincerity. He glanced at Jacob's grandmother, who sat with her hands folded tightly, and then back at the boy whose big eyes looked so hopeful, yet so full of pain. "First of all, let me tell you," Trump began, his voice steady but softer than before. "That's one of the most important questions anyone can ask. And it's not an easy one. But I'll do my best to answer it." The room was utterly silent. Even the reporters, who were normally busy typing on their laptops or scribbling notes, had put down their pens. Trump shifted in his seat, folding his hands on the table in front of him. "I grew up in Queens, New York. My mother, Mary, was a deeply religious woman. She taught me and my siblings to pray every night. She would tell us, God has a plan for everyone, even if we don't understand it. As a kid, I didn't think much about what that meant. Life seemed simple back then. But as I grew older, I faced challenges, losses, failures, things that made me question everything. And I'll be honest, Jacob, there were times I wondered if God was really listening." Jacob tilted his head, listening intently. Trump continued, his tone unusually introspective. "When I was in my 30s, I went through a tough time. My company was struggling, my father had passed away, and it felt like everything I'd built was crumbling. I remember one night sitting alone in my office, staring out at the city lights and thinking, why God? Why is this happening to me? I didn't have an answer that night, but I prayed anyway. And you know what? Things didn't change overnight, but slowly, piece by piece, they got better. I learned something important, that even in the darkest times, God doesn't abandon us. He gives us the strength to keep going." The little boy's grip on the microphone tightened. "But why does he let bad things happen to good people? My dad was a good person. Why did God take him away?" Trump's jaw tightened. For a moment, he seemed at a loss for words. Then he stood up and walked around the table, kneeling down so he was at Jacob's eye level. "I wish I could tell you why, Jacob. I really do," Trump said, his voice tinged with emotion. "But what I believe is this. Sometimes the people we love the most are called back to heaven because their job here is done. And even though it hurts, we have to trust that God has a plan for us, even if we don't see it right now. Your dad sounds like he was a wonderful man, and I believe he's still with you, watching over you. Tears welled up in Jacob's eyes. Do you really think so? I know so, Trump said firmly, and I think he'd be very proud of you for asking such a brave question today. The room was filled with the sound of sniffling. Grown men and women who had come to debate policies and platforms were wiping their eyes. Even the reporter seemed moved. Trump placed a hand on Jacob's shoulder. You're going to do great things, Jacob. I can tell. And when you feel lost, just remember what your dad taught you. Keep asking questions. Keep believing. That's what faith is all about. The crowd erupted into applause, but Jacob didn't notice. He was looking at Trump, feeling a warmth in his heart that he hadn't felt in months. The applause eventually died down, but the energy in the room remained electric. Trump returned to his seat, visibly moved, while Jacob sat back with his grandmother, clutching the microphone as if it held some sacred power. The moderator hesitated before calling for the next question, sensing that something profound had just happened. Before she could proceed, an older man in the front row stood up. His voice was steady but filled with emotion as he spoke. Excuse me, but I'd like to say something. All eyes turned to him. He was a grizzled factory worker dressed in a faded flannel shirt and worn jeans. I lost my wife 5 years ago to cancer. I was angry at God for a long time, asking the same question this boy just asked. Why? He looked at Jacob, his voice cracking. But you know what? I realized something. Her suffering taught me how to be strong, for my kids, for myself. It's not easy to see it in the moment, but sometimes God gives us the tools to endure, not the answers we want. The room murmured in agreement, and the man sat down, his face red with emotion. A young woman in the middle of the crowd raised her hand. She introduced herself as a school teacher and shared her own story about losing her best friend in a car accident. For years, I struggled with the idea of faith. But hearing you, Jacob, and you, Mr. Trump, reminds me that faith is about more than understanding. It's about trusting. Thank you for that reminder. One by one, people began sharing their stories. A single mother talked about raising her children after her husband left, crediting her faith for giving her strength. A veteran spoke of finding hope after losing friends in combat. Each story seemed to build on the last, creating a wave of shared humanity that filled the room. Trump listened intently, his usual commanding presence softened by the vulnerability around him. For once, it wasn't about him or his policies. It was about the people, their struggles, their faith, and their shared hope. Jacob, sitting quietly next to his grandmother, watched in awe. For the first time since his father's passing, he didn't feel so alone. As the town hall wound down, the moderator called for one last question, but no one seemed to have the words to follow what had just transpired. The moment hung in the air, thick with shared emotion. The crowd began to disperse, but many lingered to talk amongst themselves, some still wiping their eyes, others offering quiet words of encouragement to Jacob and his grandmother. Jacob, now holding his grandmother's hand, stepped toward Trump. The former president, seeing the boy approach, bent down to his level with a smile. You did great today, Jacob, Trump said, his voice warm and sincere. You've made a big impact. Jacob looked up at him, a small smile tugging at his lips. Thank you, Mr. Trump. I feel better, like I'm not alone. I'm proud of you, Trump replied. You've got a lot of courage. Keep that fire inside you. The crowd had thinned, but the sense of connection remained. The event, initially meant to be a political forum, had transformed into something deeply human, a space where faith, grief, and the search for meaning transcended the usual partisan boundaries. The next morning, the event made headlines across the country. Clips of Jacob's question and Trump's emotional response quickly went viral. Social media erupted with hashtags like #faith and leadership and #ask big questions. Some users praised Trump's heartfelt answer, while others questioned his sincerity. But beyond the debates and opinions, one thing was clear. The moment had struck a chord with millions. Churches, schools, and community centers across the country began to use the event as a point of reflection. Many organized local gatherings to discuss faith and hardship, and Jacob's simple question about loss became a common topic of conversation. People who had long struggled with their own questions of faith, or who had experienced deep personal pain, found themselves comforted by the raw honesty of the moment. Jacob, meanwhile, tried to adjust to the newfound attention. He'd never expected his question to stir up so much. The letters, messages, and donations poured in from people who were touched by his bravery. It seemed like everywhere he went, there was someone who had a story to share, someone who had been touched by his question. In the following weeks, Jacob and his grandmother started a small initiative called Jacob's Light, dedicated to supporting children who had lost parents. It began with just a few local families meeting in their church basement, but as word spread, it grew. They hosted grief support groups, provided books on coping with loss, and offered resources for families to heal together. Jacob found strength in knowing that what had begun as a personal search for answers had helped others find their own path through the darkness. He didn't have all the answers, but he had something just as important: faith. Months later, as Jacob sat in his room reading letters of thanks from families who had been touched by Jacob's Light, he received an unexpected piece of mail. It was a letter from Trump, handwritten on official stationery. "Dear Jacob, I wanted to thank you again for your courage. Your question reminded me and the whole world what truly matters. Never stop asking the big questions and never lose your light. I'm proud of you. Sincerely, Donald J. Trump." Jacob framed the letter and hung it on the wall of his room. It was a reminder not just of the moment they had shared, but of the hope that had been sparked. He knew his journey was just beginning. Years later, as Jacob grew up, he often thought back to that day. He didn't have all the answers, no one did, but he had something just as important: the belief that even in pain, there was purpose. And even though he couldn't always see God's plan, he had learned that faith wasn't about understanding, it was about trusting. Jacob's story didn't end with a question asked in a town hall. It grew into something bigger, a reminder that sometimes the answers we seek come not in words but in actions. And in the darkest moments, the light we need is already inside us. We just have to choose to believe in it. And somewhere in a quiet office, Trump reflected on the boy who had asked him the hardest question of his life. For all the debates and decisions he had faced, it was that moment of raw honesty that stayed with him. In the end, it wasn't about politics or power. It was about a little boy, a big question, and a room full of people who dared to believe in something greater than themselves. Love a good story? Subscribe to Tailcraft for exciting adventures and creative tales that will keep you hooked. Don't miss out. Join us and fuel your imagination today. Hit the bell for fresh stories every day.